did not scream. She did not cry. She stood at the altar in front of 300 people, looked the richest man in Boston straight in the eye, and dropped her wedding veil at his feet like it was nothing more than a lie she was done carrying. The church went silent. The flowers still smelled sweet. The candles still burned. But Clara Whitmore had already made her decision 3 days ago, the moment she found her dead mother's letter hidden at the bottom of a drawer. If you believe a woman's dignity is worth more than any dowry, subscribe to this channel. Follow Clara's story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1816 arrived in Boston, like a debt that had been waiting years to be collected. The heat settled over the city's cobblestone streets, without mercy pressing down on the fine houses along Beacon Hill, baking the iron fences and brick storefronts of the merchant district, turning the harbor air thick and still. It was the kind of summer that made people irritable, careless and honest, in ways they would later regret. Clara Whitmore had not slept in 3 days. She sat at her dressing table on the morning of her wedding, while her aunt's housemaid laced the back of her gown, and she stared at her own face in the mirror, with the careful measuring look of a woman trying to decide whether she recognized herself anymore. The white silk caught the morning light. The pearls at her throat had belonged to her mother. The letter folded against her ribs, tucked beneath the bodice of the most expensive dress she had ever worn, pressed against her skin like a brand. Her maid, young Hannah, was humming something low and cheerful under her breath. "You'll be the most beautiful bride Boston has seen in 10 years, Miss Whitmore," Hannah said, pulling the last loop tight. Clara said nothing. She watched her own reflection. Dark eyes, pale cheeks, jaw set in a line that her father had always called stubborn and her mother had always called strong. She thought about the difference between those two words. She thought about her mother's handwriting, small, precise, slightly tilted to the right, and the way the ink had bled at the bottom corner of the page, as though the paper had been held too tightly while it was written. She thought about what a woman writes when she knows she is running out of time. "Miss Whitmore." Hannah was looking at her in the mirror now, uncertain. "Are you all right?" "Finish the buttons," Clara said quietly. "Please." The Whitmore family had once been among the most respected merchant families in Boston. Her grandfather had built the business from nothing, dry goods shipping contracts, a small but steady import trade that had kept the family comfortable for 2 generations. Her father, Edmund Whitmore, had inherited both the business and the name, and for a long time that had been enough. Then Silas Ashford had come into their lives. Silas Ashford was a banker. More than a banker, he was the kind of man around whom other men straightened their spines and lowered their voices. He controlled 3 of Boston's most significant private accounts, sat on the board of the Massachusetts Mercantile Bank, and wore the particular expression of a man who had never once in his adult life been told no. He had been Edmund Whitmore's business partner, his financial advisor, and the man Edmund trusted above almost anyone else. That trust had cost the Whitmore family everything. Clara had been 15 when the money started disappearing. She had not understood it at the time, that her father's face had changed, that the dinners became quieter, that her mother had begun keeping the household ledgers herself, and staying up late at the writing desk by the parlor window. She had not understood why her mother looked so tired, or why she sometimes stood at the kitchen window for long minutes without moving, staring at nothing with her hands pressed flat against the sill as though she needed something solid to hold on to. Eleanor Whitmore had died when Clara was 17. Consumption, the doctor said. A body worn down and not strong enough to recover. Clara had accepted that for 7 years, until 3 days ago. It had been an accident, in the way that the most shattering discoveries always are. Clara had been searching for her mother's pearl earrings, the ones she had planned to wear at the wedding, in the old rosewood jewelry box that had sat in the back of her late mother's wardrobe for 9 years. She had found the earrings. She had also found, tucked beneath the velvet tray at the bottom of the box, a folded letter sealed with a small pressed wax mark that had cracked nearly in half. The outside was addressed to no one. Clara had stood alone in the quiet of her old childhood bedroom in the house that no longer quite felt like home, and she had broken the seal. She recognized her mother's handwriting immediately. She read it once. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and read it again slower, though her hands were already beginning to shake. The letter was addressed to Silas Ashford. It was written in the winter of 1809, 7 years ago, 4 months before Eleanor Whitmore died. In it, Eleanor stated clearly, calmly, without hysteria, in the careful language of a woman who had learned to be precise because no one would believe her if she was not, that she had discovered the account manipulation. That she had found the transfer records herself, buried in a set of files Edmund believed were routine bank documents. That she knew Silas had moved funds from the Whitmore business accounts into a set of private holding accounts that bore no family name. That she knew the withdrawals had been systematic, designed to look like ordinary losses, market shifts, contract failures, the natural misfortunes of trade. She knew it had not been natural at all. Eleanor had written that she was not going to the law. Not yet. She was asking Silas, begging him in plain language that Clara could barely read, without her throat closing, to restore what he had taken. She said she did not want to destroy her husband's dignity. She said Edmund did not know. She said she only wanted her children to have what had been theirs. She said she would stay silent if he corrected it. The letter had never been sent. At the bottom, in different ink, slightly darker, the pen pressed harder. Eleanor had added one final line written at a different time, perhaps weeks later. He will not correct it. He has threatened the accounts further. I have nowhere left to go. If anyone finds this, Clara, if you find this, know that your father never failed us. He was betrayed by a man he trusted. That is not weakness. That is grief. Clara had sat in that room for a very long time. She had told no one for 3 days. Not her father, not her friends, not the wedding planner or the caterer, or the woman who had spent 2 weeks altering the white silk gown to fit her perfectly. She had told only one person, Aunt Abigail. Aunt Abigail Whitmore was her father's older sister, 56 years old, widowed, young, sharp as good flint, and one of the only people in Clara's life who had never once told her that her instincts were wrong. She lived in a modest 10 miles outside the city, kept a garden, raised chickens, read extensively, and had a habit of saying the true thing when everyone else was still deciding whether it was appropriate to say it. Clara had ridden out to see her the evening she found the letter. Abigail had read the letter at the kitchen table with a single candle burning. She had not spoken for a full minute after she finished. Then she had set the letter down, very carefully folded her hands on top of it, and looked at Clara. Nathaniel Ashford, she said. His father's estate passed to him in 1812. Yes, Clara said. He knew. I don't know that yet. Clara. Abigail's voice was quiet. He knew. Clara had driven back to Boston in the dark. She had not slept. She had sat in the parlor of her family's house listening to the city outside and turning that single word over in her mind. Knew. She had gone over every conversation she had ever had with Nathaniel Ashford. Every dinner, every evening, in the Whitmore parlor, every careful and measured exchange. She had agreed to the engagement 8 months ago, a practical match her father had called it, with a kind of exhausted relief that she had not fully understood at the time. Nathaniel was wealthy, well-regarded, controlled in every public setting. He was not warm exactly, but he was not cruel. She had believed he was honest. She had turned it over and over in her mind until her hands went still in her lap, and she sat in the silence of the empty house and understood that she had been the last piece of a plan she had never been told about. The marriage would have buried the crime completely. Clara Whitmore, daughter of the man Silas Ashford had ruined, married to Silas Ashford's son. The money absorbed. The records sealed behind a wedding certificate. The family's silence purchased with the one thing Edmund Whitmore still had left to give his daughter. She sat with that understanding for the rest of the night. By morning, she had made her decision. The church was full. 300 guests. Boston's finest. The banking families, the merchant families, the women who sat on charity boards, and the men who sat on bank boards, and the young couples who had come because a Whitmore-Ashford wedding was the social event of the summer. The pews were full of white gloves and good hats. The flowers were exceptional. The organ filled the high stone ceiling with something solemn and beautiful. Edmund Whitmore walked his daughter down the aisle with his chin up and his eyes bright with something that looked from a distance exactly like pride. Clara walked beside him and felt the letter against her ribs with every step. Nathaniel Ashford stood at the altar ahead of them. He was tall, well-made, in a dark coat that fit him precisely. His face was composed. He watched her come down the aisle with the careful, unreadable expression he wore in every public setting, the expression of a man who had been trained since boyhood to reveal nothing. He was handsome in the way that certain men are handsome, not warmly, not openly, but with a kind of controlled precision that made other people feel slightly off balance around him. When she reached the altar, he held out his hand. Clara looked at it for a moment. She looked at his face. His eyes were dark gray. She had always noticed that, and they were watching her now with an expression she could not quite name. Not guilt, not fear. Something quieter than that. Something that looked almost like resignation. As though some part of him had been waiting for this, and he had already decided that he would not run from it when it came. She did not take his hand. She reached up instead and unfastened her veil. The church was already beginning to shift, the small, uncertain rustle of 300 people who had collectively sensed that something was wrong and had not yet understood what. She heard her father's breathing change beside her. She heard the minister clear his throat gently. She let the veil fall from her fingers. It dropped to the stone floor between them, white silk pooling around her feet, and the sound it made was almost nothing, just a whisper of fabric, but in the silence of that church, it was as loud as a door slamming shut. The church froze. Her father leaned toward her, his voice a desperate whisper. Clara, Clara, don't do this. Not here. Whatever it is, not here. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Nathaniel. The minister said, uncertain and gentle, Miss Whitmore, shall we? No, Clara said. Her voice was quiet, completely steady. The kind of steady that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from the presence of absolute certainty. We shall not. Nathaniel had not moved. He was still watching her, still wearing that expression she could not name. I found my mother's letter, Clara said. She said it only to him. But in a church that silent every word carried to the back pew, something shifted in Nathaniel's face. The controlled composure did not break. It was not that kind of shift. It was subtler than that. A tightening around the eyes, a tension in the jaw. The expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular door to open, and is now watching it open, and is not in the end surprised. Clara. His voice was low. Careful. Don't, she said. Don't explain it to me here. I did not come here for an explanation. She reached into the bodice of her gown and withdrew the letter folded and sealed. She held it for a moment, her mother's handwriting on paper her mother had touched, and then she set it on the altar rail between them. I came here to give that back to the Ashford family. It belongs to you more than it belongs to me now. The minister made a small strangled sound. Her father said, Clara, please. She turned to look at her father. Then, and what she saw in his face nearly broke her. He looked frightened. He looked old. He looked like a man standing on ground he did not know had been hollow under him for years. She wanted to tell him everything right then in front of everyone, just to watch the weight lift off of him. She wanted to say, it was not your fault. It was never your fault. You were betrayed by someone you trusted, and you never knew it, and you have been blaming yourself for 11 years for something you did not do. She didn't say it. Not here. Not like this. She looked back at Nathaniel. Keep the dowry, she said. I will not marry a man who built a future on top of my mother's grave and called it a gift. She picked up her skirts and she walked away from the altar. She did not run. She did not cry. She did not look at the 300 faces turning toward her in the pews. Not at the women gripping their fans. Not at the men, straightening in their seats. Not at the young girls who would talk about this for years. She walked the length of that aisle with her spine straight, and her hands at her sides, and her shoes making a clear, unhurried sound on the stone floor. Behind her, she heard someone, a woman near the front, draw a sharp breath. She heard her father say her name once more quietly, almost to himself, as though he were speaking to someone who had already left the room. She heard Nathaniel say nothing at all. The church doors opened ahead of her, and the summer heat came in like a wave, and she stepped out into the bright, terrible light of a Boston morning, and kept walking. The hired carriage was waiting on the street outside. She had arranged it herself 2 days ago on the morning after she rode back from Aunt Abigail's house. She had told the driver only to wait. He was a young man with an honest face, and he had not asked questions. He looked startled when she appeared at the church door, alone, still in her wedding gown, carrying nothing except the small bag she had placed under the front pew before the service. "Miss," he said. "I'm ready," Clara said. "Drive, please." She climbed in without assistance. She sat straight. She pressed one hand flat against her ribs, where the letter had been, against the place where the paper was no longer warm against her skin, and she felt the absence of it. The way you feel the absence of a stone you have been carrying for too long. Not grief, not relief, but something between the two. Behind her, the church was still silent. Ahead of her, the road out of Boston stretched long and dusty and lit gold by the morning sun. The driver clicked his tongue at the horses. The carriage moved. Clara Whitmore sat in the back in her white silk gown and let the city fall behind her, and she did not look back once. She was 24 years old, and she had just walked away from the only future anyone had ever planned for her, and her hands were steady, and the only thing she felt with absolute certainty, as the carriage carried her away from the church and the guests, and the man who had stood at the altar and said nothing, was that her mother, wherever she was, already knew and understood. The carriage ride to Aunt Abigail's house took nearly 2 hours, and Clara did not speak a single word the entire way. The driver did not ask any questions. He was smart enough for that. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands on the reins, and he drove at a steady pace while the summer heat pressed down on everything and the city gradually thinned out behind them, the close-packed buildings giving way to wider lots, then to open land, then to the quieter roads that wound through the outskirts of Boston toward the smaller towns beyond. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the road move under the wheels and thought about nothing, or tried to think about nothing. The truth was that her mind was doing what it always did when she was most frightened: organizing, cataloging, listing what she knew against what she did not yet know. The way her mother had once taught her to balance a household ledger. Start with what is certain, then work outward. What was certain? The letter existed. She had read it herself. Her mother had written it herself. The words were clear and specific, and written by a woman who had understood exactly what she was recording and why. What was not yet certain: how much Nathaniel had known. When he had known it. Whether he had found the letter himself, or had been told by his father. Whether the marriage had been his idea, or merely something he had agreed to, a quiet correction to an old wrong that did not require him to admit the wrong existed. She turned that last thought over carefully, the way you turn a stone to check the underside. It did not matter, she told herself. It did not matter how much he had known, or when he had known it, or what he had intended to do. What mattered was what he had done, and what he had done was nothing. For 8 months, for however long he had known, he had looked at her father's exhausted face and her family's diminished circumstances, and he had said nothing. He had brought flowers to the Whitmore parlor and discussed the weather and asked politely about the wedding arrangements, and he had said nothing. The carriage wheels hit a rut in the road and jolted hard, and Clara gripped the doorframe and steadied herself and kept her eyes on the passing land. By the time the carriage turned down the narrow lane that led to Aunt Abigail's house, her hands had stopped shaking entirely. Abigail was in the front garden when the carriage came up the lane, and she stood up from her work immediately, not with surprise. Clara noticed, but with the particular expression of a woman who had been expecting something and was relieved the waiting was over. She did not say anything when Clara stepped down from the carriage in her wedding gown. She simply looked at her niece's face, read what was there, and said, "Come inside." They sat at the kitchen table. Abigail put water on and did not ask a single question until Clara was seated and had both hands wrapped around a plain ceramic mug. Then she sat down across from her and said, "Tell me how it went." "I did what I said I would do," Clara said. "And Nathaniel?" "He said nothing." Clara paused. "He let me go." Abigail was quiet for a moment. That could mean a great many things. I know what it means, Clara said. It means he already knew I had the letter. It means he understood why I was doing it. It means some part of him knew it was coming and decided that stopping me was not something he had the right to do. Or, Abigail said carefully, it means he is the kind of man who freezes when the moment arrives. I don't think that's what it was. No, Abigail agreed quietly. Neither do I. The water came to a boil, and she got up to pour it, and neither of them spoke for a minute, and the silence in that kitchen was the kind of silence that has shape to it, the kind that sits in a room after a long-held truth has finally been said aloud. Abigail set a fresh cup in front of Clara and sat back down. Your father will come here, she said. Probably by evening. I know. He's going to be frightened. He's going to say things he doesn't mean. I know that too, Clara. Abigail leaned forward slightly. Are you all right? Clara looked at her aunt. She thought about the question seriously, the way Abigail had always taught her to take serious questions seriously. She thought about the church and the veil on the stone floor and the 300 faces, and her father's voice saying her name in that quiet, broken way. She thought about the drive home and the 2 hours of organized silence in the back of a carriage. I am not all right, she said honestly. But I am not broken. There is a difference. Abigail reached across the table and pressed her hand once hard and let go. Yes, she said. There is. Edmund Whitmore arrived at 4:30 in the afternoon. Clara heard the horse before she saw him, a fast, hard approach up the lane, not the measured pace of a man who had thought carefully about what he was going to say. She was sitting in the small parlor with a book open in her lap that she had not read a single word of, and when she heard the horse, she closed the book and set it aside and straightened her spine. He came through the door without knocking. His hat was in his hand, and his face was the color of old ash, and his eyes went directly to Clara the moment he was through the door, the way a man's eyes go to the thing he has been afraid of losing. Clara, he said. His voice was not angry. It was worse than angry, it was desperate. Clara, what have you done? Sit down, father, she said. I don't want to sit down. Do you understand what happened this morning? Do you understand 300 people? Clara. 300. Father. Her voice was quiet, but it was the voice of a woman who had made her decision 3 days ago and was not going to be moved by volume or urgency. Sit down, please. There is something I need to tell you. Something in her tone stopped him. He stood for a moment in the doorway with his hat in his hands looking at her face, and whatever he saw there, the steadiness, the certainty, the particular expression that his late wife had also worn when she was about to say something that could not be unsaid, made him go still. He sat down. Clara took a breath, and then she told him everything. She told him about the jewelry box, and the letter, and the wax seal broken nearly in half. She told him about her mother's handwriting, small and precise, and tilted slightly to the right. She told him what the letter said, the account manipulation, the transfer records, the systematic withdrawals designed to look like ordinary losses. She told him about the final line her mother had added at the bottom in different ink, the words pressed harder. Your father never failed us. He was betrayed by a man he trusted. That is not weakness. That is grief. She told him all of it. And she watched her father's face change. It did not change the way a face changes when it receives bad news. It changed the way a face changes when something that has been pressed down for years suddenly has nowhere left to go. She watched his expression move through disbelief and then through a dawning terrible recognition, the look of a man realizing that the story he had been telling himself for 11 years, the story in which his own failures destroyed his family, was not the true story. And then something cracked open in his face that she had not seen there since she was very small. Edmund Whitmore put his face in his hands. He did not make a sound for a long moment. Just sat there with his hands over his face while the kitchen clock ticked and the summer light moved through the window, and his daughter sat across from him and waited. Then he said from behind his hands, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, She knew. Eleanor knew. Yes, Clara said. She never told me. She was protecting you. She thought if she could get Silas to reverse it quietly, she was protecting me. His voice fractured on the last word. He pulled his hands away from his face and looked at Clara with eyes that were red and wet and completely undone. She was dying, and she was protecting me. And she never said a word. Clara's throat was very tight. She loved you, she said. She did not want you to carry the knowledge of it. She carried it alone. Edmund's voice had gone low and rough, the voice of a man who was feeling something with his whole body. She carried it alone and it... He stopped. He pressed his fist against his mouth and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked back at his daughter. I blamed myself, he said. For 11 years, Clara. I thought it was my mistakes, my bad judgment. I thought I had failed her, failed all of you. You were betrayed, Clara said, by a man you trusted. That is not the same thing. He looked at her for a long time. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone who has just handed them back something they had given up for lost, and he did not seem to know yet what to do with it. Where is the letter now? He finally asked. I left it at the altar, Clara said. On the altar rail, in front of Nathaniel. Her father's expression shifted. You left it why? Because it belongs to the Ashford family. Because I want Nathaniel to look at it and know that I know what it contains and that I will not pretend otherwise. Because I did not want to carry it with me for the rest of my life. She paused. And because I wanted him to understand that I did not need to keep the evidence to win. The truth is the evidence. That is enough. Edmund stared at her. Your mother, he said slowly, used to say something like that. I know, Clara said. I learned it from her. The gossip reached them by the next morning. Abigail had a neighbor, a practical woman named Mrs. Howe, who drove into town every Tuesday for market and came back with more information than a newspaper. And by 9 o'clock that morning, Mrs. Howe had appeared at the kitchen door with a basket of eggs and a compressed expression that meant she was carrying something she was not sure whether to say. Abigail looked at her and said, Tell us. Mrs. Howe set down her basket. They're saying she lost her mind, she said without preamble. Half the town is saying Clara had some kind of episode nerves, they're calling it. Too much pressure of the wedding. She paused. The other half is saying she held the wedding hostage for more money. That she tried to renegotiate the dowry terms, and Nathaniel refused, and she made a scene. Clara was very still. That is what they're saying, she said. That is what the Ashford family is allowing people to say, Mrs. Howe said carefully. No one has corrected it. Abigail's jaw tightened. Nathaniel hasn't spoken publicly. Not a word. His mother gave one statement to the effect that the wedding was postponed due to an unforeseen family matter, and that the Ashford family hopes for a peaceful resolution. Mrs. Howe looked at Clara. Whatever that means, what it meant. Clara understood immediately was that Nathaniel was holding his position, neither confirming nor denying, neither exposing the truth, nor burying it, simply waiting to see what Clara would do next. It was, she thought with a cold and clear-eyed recognition, exactly the kind of calculated restraint that had allowed the original crime to go unaddressed for 11 years. The Ashford family specialty silence deployed as a weapon. He is waiting for me to come back, Clara said. Probably, Abigail said. He thinks if he gives me a few days I'll reconsider, that the practical reality will take hold. Clara looked at her hands on the table. My father's position, the family name, the social damage of a broken engagement. Those are not small things, Abigail said. No, Clara agreed. They are not, but they are not the same thing as truth. Mrs. Howe picked up her basket. I'll let you know if I hear anything else, she said, and she left the way she had come, practical and purposeful, and the kitchen door closed behind her. Edmund, who had been listening from the doorway with his arms crossed and a look on his face that had been shifting steadily from grief toward something harder and more resolved, said, What do you intend to do? Clara looked at him. I intend to get the truth into the legal record, she said. Not as revenge, not to destroy the Ashford name, but because you have spent 11 years believing a lie, and I will not allow that lie to be the official version of events. Her father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You'll need documentation, the transfer records. Yes. Those would be held at the Massachusetts Mercantile Bank. Yes. The Ashford family controls 2 seats on that board. I know, Clara said. Which is why we are not going to the bank. We are going to Judge Monroe. Judge Elias Monroe was 63 years old, a widower, a Congregationalist, and the most respected jurist in Suffolk County. He had known Edmund Whitmore since they were young men, had attended Eleanor Whitmore's funeral, and had a reputation for the kind of quiet and absolute integrity that made dishonest men deeply uncomfortable in his presence. He also, as it happened, had no patience whatsoever for the Ashford family. Abigail had written him a letter the same evening. Edmund arrived, and by the following afternoon, she had received his reply. He would see Clara on Thursday at his private office. He would hear what she had to say. He could make no promises about what could be done, but he would listen, and that, as Abigail explained to Clara with the practical certainty of someone who had lived long enough to know the difference, was not nothing. It was in fact exactly where everything had to start. Clara spent Wednesday night writing out the full account by hand, every detail she could reconstruct from the letter, every piece of financial history she could remember, every date and name and figure. She wrote it with the same small, precise handwriting her mother had used. She wrote it carefully without emotion in the language, because she had learned early that emotion in legal language gives people an excuse to dismiss the argument and focus on the feeling. By the time she finished, it was past 2 in the morning, and the candle had burned down nearly to its holder. She sat back and read what she had written, and thought about her mother sitting up late at the writing desk by the parlor window, keeping the household ledgers, finding the discrepancies, understanding what they meant. Doing the same work Clara was doing now, gathering the evidence, making the case, doing it quietly and alone, because there was no other way. The difference was that Eleanor had been alone. Clara was not. Nathaniel Ashford appeared at Aunt Abigail's gate on Wednesday morning. Clara saw him from the upstairs window, not because she was watching for him, but because she had been standing there for an entirely different reason, and he had simply appeared as though the conversation she had been mentally rehearsing had decided to arrange itself in real life ahead of schedule. He came on horseback alone without attendants, which was either a sign of respect or strategy or both. He dismounted at the gate and tied his horse and stood for a moment with one hand on the fence post, and his face turned toward the house, and even at that distance she could see the characteristic stillness of him, that controlled, contained quality that she had once mistaken for composure and now understood was more complicated than that. She came downstairs. Abigail was in the kitchen, and she looked up when Clara came through and said, "He's outside." "I know. Do you want me to send him away?" "No," Clara said. "I'll speak to him." She went out through the front door and across the small front yard and stopped a few feet from the gate. He was on the other side of it, and for a moment they simply looked at each other through the wooden slats of the fence, which Clara thought had a certain accuracy to it. "You came alone," she said. "Yes." His voice was even. "I didn't think an audience would be appropriate. Unlike the last time you had something to say to me." Something moved across his face, not quite a flinch. "Clara." "How long?" she said. "How long did you know?" He did not look away. She had expected deflection, the polished, careful evasion of a man trained in public appearances. Instead, he looked directly at her and said, 2 years. The word landed in her chest like something cold. 2 years, she repeated. "I found the corresponding documents in my father's papers after he died. Records that matched what your mother described in the letter. Though I didn't know the letter existed then. I knew there had been a manipulation. I knew the Whitmore accounts had been deliberately damaged." He paused. "I told myself I would correct it after the marriage. That restoring the money through the family connection was cleaner. Less damaging to your father's pride. Less damaging to your family's reputation," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That too." She looked at him. A man who had just told the truth about an ugly thing, which was not nothing. She was honest enough with herself to recognize that. A man who had not, when she walked away from the altar, tried to stop her or deny it, or send someone after her with a better story. A man who was standing alone at a fence gate in the summer heat, and not pretending to be something he had not been. That was not innocence. But it was something. "I'm going to see Judge Munro on Thursday," she said. "I'm going to ask him to place the truth of what your father did into the legal record. Not to prosecute anyone, your father is dead, and that door is closed. But to correct the official account. To give my father back the version of events that is true." Nathaniel was very still. "That will damage my family publicly." "Yes," Clara said. "It will." "Clara." "Nathaniel." Her voice was not unkind, but it had no softness in it either. "You want me to do this quietly, through a private settlement, through a correction that takes place behind closed doors, where no one has to change their understanding of anything." She shook her head once. "That is what your father did. That is exactly what your father did. He damaged my family quietly where no one could see it, and he counted on the silence to hold." She met his eyes through the fence. "I will not do this quietly." He held her gaze. He did not argue. "Will you oppose it?" she asked. "At the hearing." The pause before he answered was long enough that she felt it in her ribs. "No," he said finally. "I won't oppose it." She studied his face for another moment. Then she said, "Then we have nothing more to discuss today." She turned and walked back to the house. She heard him stand at the gate for another moment. She could not have said how she knew it, only that she did. And then she heard him untie his horse and ride back down the lane, and she went inside and closed the door behind her, and stood in the hallway, and breathed steadily, once, twice, 3 times. Abigail appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Well," she said. "He knew for 2 years," Clara said. Abigail's expression went very still. And he won't oppose the hearing." Clara pressed one hand briefly to her sternum. Not grief, not relief, that same complicated thing between the two. "He is not a good man yet," she said quietly. "But I think he may be trying to become one, and I don't know yet what to do with that." Abigail looked at her for a long moment. "You don't have to know yet," she said. "Thursday comes first." "Yes," Clara agreed. She straightened her spine. "Thursday comes first." Thursday came in fast and hard, the way every day comes when you have spent the night before it not sleeping. Clara was dressed and ready before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. She wore her plainest dress, dark blue wool, no ornamentation, nothing that could be read as performance or appeal. She had learned from her mother that when a woman walks into a room full of men who are already looking for reasons to dismiss her, she should give them nothing decorative to fix their eyes on. She should make them look at her face. She should make them deal with the fact of her. Abigail was already in the kitchen when Clara came downstairs, and Edmund was there too, seated at the table with his hands wrapped around a mug he had apparently forgotten to drink from. He looked up when Clara entered and studied her for a moment, the way he had been studying her since Wednesday, with a combination of grief and pride, and something rawer than both that he had not yet found language for. "You don't have to come," Clara said to him. "Yes, I do," he said. She did not argue. They rode into Boston in Abigail's carriage, the 3 of them, and the city was already awake and moving around them. Merchants opening their storefronts, servants running morning errands. A group of young men on horseback who slowed to look at Clara with expressions she recognized and did not acknowledge. The story of the wedding had been in circulation for 4 days now. She could feel it on the street, the same way you feel a change in weather, a pressure, a shift in the quality of the air around her. A woman near the dry goods shop said something to her companion that Clara did not hear, but she saw the companion look up. Clara kept her eyes forward. Judge Munro's private office was on the 2nd floor of a solid brick building on Court Street, and when his clerk showed them in, the judge was already at his desk with a stack of papers in front of him, and the particular expression of a man who had read something that had not improved his opinion of certain members of Boston society. He stood when they entered. He shook Edmund's hand. He looked at Clara and said, "Miss Whitmore, sit down. Tell me everything." So she did. She spoke for nearly 40 minutes without interruption. She laid out the full account. The letter, the timeline, the specific financial mechanism her mother had described, the matching documentation that Nathaniel had confirmed existed in his father's papers. She spoke clearly without emotion in the language the way she had written it out the night before. She watched Judge Monroe's face, and she saw his expression move through careful attention, then through a tightening around the eyes that meant recognition, then through something very controlled and deliberate that told her he was managing his own reaction. When she finished, the room was quiet. Monroe set down his pen. He looked at Edmund. "Did you know any of this?" he said. Edmund's voice was rough. "Not until 4 days ago." "And for 11 years you believed the losses were your own mismanagement?" "Yes." Monroe turned his gaze to the papers in front of him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Silas Ashford has been dead for 4 years. Criminal prosecution is not available to us." He held up one hand before either of them could speak. "However, what is available is a civil petition to the probate court to correct the administrative record of the Whitmore accounts. If Nathaniel Ashford will produce the corresponding documents from his father's estate, which he has confirmed exist, then we can establish the factual record formally and permanently." He paused. "It will not return the full sum with interest through the court itself. That would require a separate civil action that could take years. But it will place the truth in the public record under judicial authority where it cannot be quietly buried again." Clara leaned forward. "What does it require from Nathaniel?" "His voluntary cooperation," Monroe said. "The documents, a sworn statement." He looked at her steadily. "He will have to say on the record that his father committed a deliberate financial fraud against your family. He will have to say it in front of witnesses." "He told me he would not oppose the hearing," Clara said. "Not opposing and actively testifying are two different things, Miss Whitmore." "I know," she said. "I'll speak to him." Monroe studied her. Then he said something she had not expected. "Your mother came to me," he said quietly. "In the winter of 1809. She sat in that same chair. She was thinner than she should have been, and she had a letter she had written and not yet sent, and she asked me whether she had enough to bring a case." He stopped. "I told her the evidence was insufficient without the bank records, and that without those records, any claim would be her word against Silas Ashford's reputation. I told her to wait until she had more documentation." The room was absolutely still. "She ran out of time," Clara said. "Yes." Monroe's voice was careful and very controlled. "She did, and I have thought about that conversation more times than I care to count in the years since." He looked at Clara with the direct gaze of a man who was not offering himself absolution, only honesty. "I will not tell you to wait this time. Whatever you need from this office, you will have it." Clara held his gaze. Her throat was very tight. "Thank you," she said. That was all she said. It was enough. She went to see Nathaniel that same afternoon. He was at his family's townhouse, the large federal-style house on Pemberton Square that his mother kept as though the continued perfection of its exterior could hold the interior in order by sheer force of aesthetic discipline. Clara arrived without sending word ahead, which she had calculated carefully. Nathaniel's mother, Helena Ashford, answered to preparation. Clara intended to give her none. The butler showed her into the front sitting room, and she stood, did not sit, stood and waited less than 3 minutes before Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. He looked at her for a moment. He looked at the fact of her standing in his family's sitting room in her plain dark dress with her hands at her sides, and she watched him take the measure of what that meant. "You could have sent a note," he said. "I could have," Clara agreed. "I didn't." "Sit down." "No." Her voice was polite, but it was a wall. "I've spoken with Judge Monroe. He's prepared to file a civil petition to the probate court to formally correct the record of my family's accounts. It requires your voluntary testimony, your documents, a sworn statement confirming what your father did." She paused. "He has a hearing scheduled for next Friday." Nathaniel was quiet for several seconds. "Clara," he started. "Don't," she said. "Don't tell me about the damage to your family's name. You told me at the fence gate that you wouldn't oppose it, and I need to know right now whether that was something you said to manage the situation or something you actually meant." He looked at her with that gray gaze that gave almost nothing away. "Almost." "I meant it," he said. Then be at Judge Monroe's office on Friday morning at 9 o'clock with the documents. She turned toward the door. Clara, she stopped. She did not turn around. I am sorry, he said. Not the way people say it when they want the conversation to end. The way people say it when the word is the only honest thing available, and they know it is not enough, and they say it anyway. For what my father did, for what I allowed to continue, I am sorry. The silence in the room lasted exactly long enough to be real. I know, Clara said, and she walked out. The trouble arrived the next morning in the form of Helena Ashford. Clara was at the kitchen table at Aunt Abigail's house when the knock came sharp and precise, 3 strikes of a walking stick against the front door, which said everything necessary about the woman on the other side of it before Abigail even reached the handle. Helena Ashford was 61 years old, fine-boned, silver-haired, and dressed in the particular manner of a woman who considered her clothing a form of argument. She stepped into Abigail's front hall with the contained, deliberate grace of someone entering a room they consider significantly below their usual standard, and she looked at Clara with pale eyes that had been calculating the angles of every situation they encountered for 6 decades. Miss Whitmore, she said, I believe we should speak privately. Aunt Abigail stays, Clara. Helena's gaze moved to Abigail and back. She sat. I will be direct, Helena said. I understand you intend to pursue a public hearing before Judge Monroe. I am here to offer you an alternative. I don't want an alternative, Clara said. You haven't heard the offer. It doesn't matter what it is. Clara's voice was level. You are going to offer me money and silence, a sum that represents a portion of what was stolen, perhaps the full sum, perhaps more. In exchange for withdrawing the hearing and signing an agreement not to pursue the matter further. You will frame it as generosity. She looked at Helena steadily. I have spent the last 4 days watching your family allow Boston to believe I had a hysterical episode at my own wedding. You have said nothing to correct that. Nothing. She paused. Whatever sum you're prepared to offer this morning, I am not interested in money that comes with silence attached to it. Helena's expression did not change precisely, but something behind her eyes shifted, a recalibration, a reassessment. She was not, Clara understood, a stupid woman. She was a woman who had spent her life using the tools available to her, and for the first time those tools were not working. The hearing will damage Nathaniel, Helena said. Not only his father's name, Nathaniel's judgment, his fitness to manage the estate. People will ask why he didn't act sooner. They will question his character. His character is his to answer for, Clara said. He is prepared to do that. Helena looked at her with an expression that was for just a moment naked in a way she clearly had not intended. You are going to ruin my son. No, Clara said. Your son is going to stand in front of a judge and tell the truth. What becomes of him after that depends entirely on who he is and what he does. I don't control that. She paused. Neither do you. Not anymore. Helena rose. She was very composed. Clara gave her that. She did not plead or raise her voice. She picked up her walking stick, and she looked at Clara one final time with those pale, calculating eyes. And what Clara saw, there was not hatred, but something almost sadder than that, the look of a woman who has lived her entire life believing that the right leverage exists for every situation. Confronting for the first time the possibility that she has encountered a situation she simply cannot lever. You are very like your mother, Helena said, and she left. Abigail waited until the front door closed. Then she said, I'll take that as a compliment on your behalf. So will I, Clara said. The society dinner happened 2 days before the hearing, and Clara had not planned to attend it until she received an unsigned note. The handwriting not Nathaniel's, but the paper monogrammed with the initials of one of Boston's oldest merchant families that said simply, They will be there. All of them. If you are not the version they are telling, becomes the only one. She showed the note to Abigail. Abigail read it once and handed it back. Who sent it? I don't know, Clara said. Does it matter? Clara thought about it. No, she said. It doesn't. She wore her mother's pearls. She wore a green silk dress that Abigail had altered to fit her, not her wedding gown, Not the plain dark wool, but something in between, something that said she was not performing grief, and she was not performing triumph either. She wore her own face, which by now had settled into an expression that she recognized when she passed a mirror, calm, clear, fully present. The expression of a woman who has stopped waiting to be told who she is. She arrived with Abigail and Edmund, and they were shown into a large dining room filled with exactly the people she had expected. The banking families, the merchant families, the same 300 who had sat in the church pews and watched her walk away. The conversation did not stop when she entered, but it changed. Register the way a musical key change happens. Not a silence, but a shift that everyone in the room feels simultaneously. Mrs. Hargrove, a wide, sharp-tongued woman who sat on 3 charity boards and considered social authority her personal domain, intercepted Clara before she reached her seat. "Miss Whitmore," she said with a smile that had no warmth behind it. "How brave of you to come, after everything." "Mrs. Hargrove," Clara said. "Good evening. We've all been so concerned. A nervous episode is nothing to be ashamed of course." "It was not a nervous episode," Clara said pleasantly and clearly, in a voice that carried to the nearest 6 tables. "I found a letter proving that my family's finances were deliberately destroyed by Silas Ashford over a period of years. I declined to marry his son until the truth was in the public record. Judge Monroe has scheduled a hearing for Friday." She smiled at Mrs. Hargrove with the same temperature the woman had offered her. "I appreciate your concern." Mrs. Hargrove opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Oh," she said. "Yes," Clara agreed, and she walked past her to her seat. The dinner was the longest 2 hours of Clara's life, and also in a strange way, some of the most clarifying. She watched how the room moved around the information she had dropped into it. She watched the women who had called her hysterical begin to recalibrate their expressions, shifting as they ran the calculation of what it would mean if the story was true, and what it would mean for their own husbands' accounts if Ashford had done it to the Whitmores. She watched the men who had done business with Silas Ashford go very still and very thoughtful over their soup. She watched Edmund sit straighter than she had seen him sit in years, responding to questions with a quiet, steady certainty that told her the weight he had been carrying for 11 years had already begun to lift. And across the room, she watched Nathaniel Ashford. How was there, she had not known he would be, but he was there, and he was watching her. Not constantly, not obviously, but when she looked in his direction, she found his eyes already on her, with that gray, unreadable expression, and she thought he came because she came. He came knowing that what was going to happen on Friday would be easier if the people in this room had already heard some version of it from her own mouth, in her own voice, with her own composure intact. That was either strategy or support. She was not sure yet which. She did not speak to him that evening, but as the room emptied and she was putting on her wrap near the door, she heard him behind her. "Mrs. Hargrove will have corrected 17 people by morning," he said quietly. "Good," Clara said without turning around. "You handled that well." "I know," she said. She turned then, because she was not going to have a conversation with the back of her own head on his behalf. She looked at him directly. "Be at Monroe's office at 9 o'clock Friday." "I'll be there," he said. She studied his face for a moment. Not looking for reassurance, she had stopped looking for reassurance from him the moment she found the letter. Looking for truth, which was a different thing. And what she found in the careful lines of his face, and the way he was holding himself like a man bracing for something he had decided not to avoid, was something she could work with. "Bring all of it," she said. "Every document. Everything your father left. Don't make Monroe ask for things twice." "I understand," he said. She nodded once. She left. Friday morning arrived with a weight to it that Clara felt the moment she opened her eyes. She lay still for exactly 1 minute, looking at the ceiling, feeling that weight settle around her, and then she got up. She dressed. She ate the breakfast Abigail put in front of her. She did not speak much, and Abigail did not push her to, which was one of the 1,000 reasons Clara loved her aunt with the kind of love that does not require explanation. Edmund was quiet too, but his quiet was different from the quiet of the previous 4 days. It was a resolved quiet. A man who had spent 11 years in the wrong story, and had finally been handed the correct one and was learning how to carry it. They arrived at Monroe's office at 8:45. Nathaniel was already there. Howe was standing in this corridor with a leather satchel in one hand, the kind of satchel that says, without being opened, that it contains exactly what it needs to contain. He looked at Clara when she came through the door, and he did not say anything, and she did not say anything, and they all went into Monroe's office together. The room held Monroe, his clerk, a representative from the probate court, and 2 witnesses. It was a small room for what was about to happen in it. Clara was aware of that, the way significant moments often choose small rooms, as though the weight of them needs to be contained rather than displayed. Monroe looked around the room and said, "We will begin." Nathaniel opened the satchel. He laid the documents on the table, one at a time. The transfer records, the holding account, ledgers, the correspondence between Silas Ashford and the bank officers who had facilitated the withdrawals. Each page landed on the table with a quiet sound that carried. Monroe examined each one. His clerk took notes. The probate representative said nothing, but Clara watched him read and watched his expression do what Abigail's had done when she first read the letter. The slow compressing recognition of a man, understanding that something he had accepted as settled fact was not settled at all. Then Monroe looked at Nathaniel and said, "Mr. Ashford, I need your statement." Nathaniel straightened. He had his hands flat on the table on either side of the documents, and he looked at Monroe with the direct, unflinching gaze of a man who had made a decision and was going to follow it through whatever it cost him. "My father, Silas Ashford, systematically diverted funds from the Whitmore family business accounts beginning in 1805, he said. His voice was steady. The withdrawals were structured to appear as market losses. They were not. I discovered the corresponding documentation in my father's estate papers in 1814. I did not report the discovery or take corrective action. That failure was mine." He paused. "I am here today to correct the record. Whatever judgment this court sees fit to make, I will not contest." The room was silent. Clara looked at her father. Edmund Whitmore was looking at the documents on the table, the papers that proved what he had never been able to prove. The evidence that the story he had been living in for 11 years was a constructed lie, and his face was doing something she had not been prepared for. It was not rage. It was not grief. It was release, the specific, devastating release of a man setting down a weight he had stopped noticing was there because he had been carrying it for so long. His shoulders dropped exactly 1 inch. That 1 inch nearly broke Clara open. Monroe made a note. He said formally, "The petition for correction of record is accepted. The administrative accounts of the Whitmore family will be corrected to reflect the factual record as established by these documents and this sworn testimony. This correction will be entered in the public probate record and will stand as the permanent official account." He looked up. "The lie is corrected, officially and permanently." And just like that, it was done. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a judge at a desk, a clerk making notes, a set of documents that told the truth, and a man saying out loud what he should have said 2 years ago. Clara sat very still. She had expected relief. She had expected the particular satisfaction of a thing completed, the clean, finalized feeling of a locked door finally opening. What she felt instead was something she had not anticipated: grief. Clean grief. Honest grief. The kind that arrives only after a fight is over, and the adrenaline leaves, and you are left standing in the quiet with the full weight of what the fight was actually about. She had been fighting for the truth about her mother's death for 3 days. But the truth was that her mother had been fighting for it for years before that, alone and exhausted and running out of time. And the correction in Monroe's ledger could not give Eleanor Whitmore back the years she had spent carrying that weight. It could not give her back at all. Clara pressed her hand flat against the table and breathed steadily, once, twice, 3 times. And she did not cry. Not yet. Not here. But she let herself feel it, all of it. The grief and the relief and the terrible clarifying weight of a truth that had waited 11 years to be spoken in the right room. Abigail, who was sitting beside her, put one hand over Clara's without a word. She did not need to say anything. Across the table, Nathaniel watched Clara's face with an expression that had come entirely unguarded for the first time since she had known him. No calculation, No composure. No controlled restraint. Just a man looking at the consequences of his silence and understanding perhaps for the first time their full dimension. Clara looked at him. She did not forgive him. She was not ready for that. She was not sure she would ever be ready in the way that word usually means. But she saw him clearly, not the man she had agreed to marry, not the man at the altar who had said nothing, but the man sitting across this table who had come with his satchel full of evidence and his father's sins laid out in his own handwriting, and had said in plain language, "I was wrong. I am correcting it. Judge me if you must." That was not innocence, but it was a beginning. She held his gaze for exactly long enough to let him know she had seen it. Then she looked back at Monroe. "What happens next?" she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. Her mother's pearls were at her throat, and the correction was in the public record, and the truth finally permanently in the right room was free. Monroe answered her question with the practical precision of a man who had spent 40 years turning injustice into paperwork, which was the only language the law reliably understood. The civil petition for account restoration, the actual return of the money with interest calculated from 1805, would require a separate filing. It would take months, possibly longer. The Ashford estate would need to agree to the sum, or the matter would go before the full probate court. Monroe was direct about the timeline, and equally direct about the obstacles. The Ashford estate was substantial, but not liquid. Helena Ashford would likely engage separate counsel, and the process would not be clean or quiet. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How long before the correction appears in the public record?" "The clerk will file it this afternoon," Monroe said. "By tomorrow morning it will be accessible to anyone who inquires." "Good," Clara said. "That is what I needed to know." She shook his hand. She shook the hand of the probate representative. She did not look at Nathaniel again as they left, not out of coldness, but because she had said what she needed to say to him, and anything further would have to wait until she had slept and eaten and spent at least 1 full hour not thinking about any of this. Outside on Court Street, the summer heat hit them immediately, and Edmund stopped walking the moment they cleared the door. He stood on the pavement with his hat in his hand and his face turned up slightly, and Clara stopped beside him and watched him breathe and did not say anything. After a long moment he said, "I want to visit her grave." "Today," Abigail said. "Today," he said. "Yes." So they went. The churchyard was quiet in the midday heat, which was a mercy. The three of them stood at Eleanor Whitmore's grave, a simple stone, her name and dates, and the single word "beloved" that Edmund had chosen, because he had not been able to think of anything that contained more, and nobody spoke for a long time. Edmund took off his hat and held it in both hands and looked at his wife's name in the stone, and Clara stood beside him and let him have whatever he needed to have. She had been thinking about her mother for 4 days, with a kind of focused intensity that had kept the grief at a careful distance, using it as fuel, rather than feeling it fully, because there had been things to do, and she could not afford to come apart before they were done. Standing here with the correction filed, and the truth finally in the record, she felt the distance collapse. She thought about the letter. About her mother sitting at a writing desk in a cold room pressing a pen against paper with shaking hands. Writing down the truth with the particular precision of a woman who knew that precision was her only weapon. Writing it for no one because she had nowhere left to send it. Writing it anyway, the way her mother had always done things anyway, the way she had kept the household ledgers when she was already ill, the way she had smiled at her children over breakfast while carrying something enormous in silence. Clara pressed 2 fingers against her mouth briefly and breathed. "She won," Edmund said quietly. He was still looking at the stone. "She never got to know it, but she won." "She won," Clara agreed. Edmund reached out and touched the top of the stone with one hand, just rested his palm flat against it for a moment, the way you touch something you have been missing for a long time. Then he put his hat back on and straightened his spine and turned around. "Tell me what I need to do for the civil filing," he said. And just like that, Edmund Whitmore stepped back into his own life. The weeks that followed moved faster than Clara had expected, and slower than she could bear. which is usually how the aftermath of large things goes. The public record correction landed in Boston the morning after the hearing, the way Monroe had said it would, and the effect was immediate and not entirely comfortable. The story was no longer about a hysterical bride. The story was now about Silas Ashford, deceased pillar of the Massachusetts Mercantile Bank, and the quiet systematic destruction of a respectable family's finances, and the son who had known and said nothing for 2 years. Mrs. Hargrove, who had already been recalibrating since the dinner, completed her recalibration entirely and became one of the story's most energetic distributors, not from any loyalty to Clara, but because the story was genuinely extraordinary, and Mrs. Hargrove had never let loyalty interfere with a good story in 60 years of living. The bank board convened an internal review. 3 newspapers printed versions of the account. 2 of those versions were reasonably accurate. The third described Clara as a wronged daughter of Boston's finest merchant tradition who bravely confronted financial corruption from the altar itself, which was not precisely how Clara would have characterized her own actions, but which her Aunt Abigail clipped from the paper and pinned to the kitchen wall without comment. Clara herself said very little publicly during this period. She was not hiding. She attended church, she walked in the market, she went about the ordinary business of a woman whose life had been significantly disrupted and was now being reconstructed from different materials. But she had said what she had to say in Judge Monroe's office, and the public record had said the rest, and she felt no particular need to perform her vindication for an audience. What she was doing quietly, and with the focused energy she had previously applied to surviving the worst week of her life, was working. It had started almost accidentally in the second week after the hearing. A woman named Mrs. Preston, 43, widowed 2 years prior, the daughter of a dry goods merchant, had appeared at Abigail's door with a folder of papers and a look on her face that Clara recognized immediately. It was the look of a woman who had discovered something wrong in a set of documents and had no one qualified to help her understand it. Clara had sat with her at the kitchen table for 2 hours, going through the papers. The estate management following her husband's death had been handled by a cousin who had, it appeared, interpreted managed on her behalf as managed for his own benefit with her name on the documentation. It was not as large a fraud as the Ashford manipulation. It was sloppier, more ordinary, the kind of petty financial opportunism that counted on a widow's ignorance and isolation to sustain itself. Clara identified 3 specific irregularities, wrote them out clearly, with references to the relevant documents, and told Mrs. Preston exactly what to bring to a lawyer. Mrs. Preston had looked at the neat written summary, and then looked at Clara and said, "How did you know how to do that?" "My mother kept the household ledgers," Clara said. "She taught me how to read an account the way most women are never taught. She said a woman who can read her own financial documents is a woman no one can deceive quietly." Mrs. Preston had gone away with her papers and her summary, and a look of focused determination that Clara found deeply satisfying. 2 days later, she had sent a friend. The friend had sent her sister. By the end of the 3rd week, Clara had seen 7 women at Aunt Abigail's kitchen table, and Abigail had started making a larger pot of tea by default every morning, and Edmund had offered the use of his own business contacts to help with any legal referrals that required a man's signature to be taken seriously, which was a requirement Clara found infuriating and practical in equal measure. "You need a proper space," Abigail said one evening, "not a kitchen table." "The kitchen table is fine," Clara said. "The kitchen table is fine for now," Abigail said. "It will not be fine in a month. You need proper space and you need it to have a name." Clara thought about that. She thought about her mother's letter, about the final line added in darker ink, "Your father never failed us. He was betrayed by a man he trusted." That is not weakness. That is grief. She thought about a woman who had understood exactly what was wrong and had nowhere to bring that understanding. "The Eleanor Whitmore Fund," she said. Abigail looked at her steadily. "For what specifically?" "For women who need help reviewing marriage contracts, inheritance documents, estate papers. For daughters whose families have been quietly robbed. For widows whose advisors have helped themselves. For any woman who finds something wrong in a document and has no one who will take her seriously." Clara paused. "For women who run out of time." The kitchen was very quiet. "Yes," Abigail said. That. Nathaniel wrote his first letter on the 14th day after the hearing. It arrived at Abigail's house by messenger, sealed with plain wax. Not the Ashford family seal. Clara noticed just plain wax, and addressed in his handwriting that she recognized from the legal documents he had laid on Monroe's table. Controlled, precise, slightly forward-leaning. She opened it alone in the small room she was using as a study. It was not an apology. She had told him not to write apologies, not because she did not want them, but because apologies were language. And language was the easiest thing to produce, and the cheapest thing to offer. And she had too much experience with people who used the right words to avoid the necessary actions. She had told him at the fence gate that she would judge him by what he did, not by what he said. He had apparently taken that seriously. The letter reported in plain and specific terms. The following: he had instructed the estate attorneys to begin the civil filing for account restoration. He had agreed in writing to the sum Monroe had calculated with interest from 1805. He had written personally to the 2 bank officers who had facilitated his father's transfers, informing them that their role in the matter was now part of the legal record. He had retracted through his own attorney the statement his mother had given describing the wedding as postponed due to an unforeseen family matter, and replaced it with a corrected statement acknowledging that the Whitmore-Ashford engagement had ended as a direct consequence of financial wrongdoing by the Ashford estate. That last item made Clara stop reading. She read it again. He had corrected his mother's statement, publicly, in writing, under his own name. She thought about what that had cost him, not financially, but in the particular currency of a man who had been trained since boyhood to protect the family name above everything. She thought about Helena Ashford receiving that news and what that conversation must have looked like, and she felt a cold respect for what it had taken him to make that correction anyway. She did not write back immediately. She set the letter on the desk and went back to work. He wrote again 3 weeks later. This letter reported that a servant named Thomas, a man who had worked in the Ashford household for 20 years, and had been dismissed the previous winter without the severance pay he was owed, had been located and paid in full, with an additional sum for the months of hardship. He reported that 2 false rumors, still circulating about Clara's conduct at the wedding, had been traced and formally denied through the same social channels that had originally spread them. He reported that the civil filing was proceeding, and that Monroe expected a resolution within the quarter. At the bottom, in slightly different handwriting. The same pen, but a different pressure, as though the hand had shifted. He had written, "I went to see your mother's grave last week. I did not plan to. I was passing the churchyard, and I went in. I stood there for a while. I did not know what I was trying to say. I think I was trying to say that I understood finally what my family's silence had cost. Not in money. In time. In life. I am sorry she did not get to see this corrected. I am more sorry than I have language for." Clara sat with that paragraph for a long time. She thought about what it means when a person goes to someone's grave, not because they knew them, but because they needed to reckon with what they owed them. She thought about the difference between guilt, which faces inward, and accountability, which faces outward. She thought about what Abigail had said at the very beginning. He knew. He had known. And he had done nothing. Those were facts that did not change. But he was also, with painful and careful consistency, doing something now. She wrote back that evening. Short, direct, no sentiment. The civil filing is proceeding on our end as well. Monroe expects the same timeline. The Eleanor Whitmore Fund is established. We have helped 11 women in the past month. My father is well. He has begun rebuilding the business contacts that were damaged. He is sleeping better. Thank you for the correction to your mother's statement. That was the right thing to do. She paused. Then she added, she would not have wanted pity at her grave. She would have wanted someone to make sure it never happened to another woman. That is what I am trying to do. She sealed it and sent it. The twist arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the hearing, in the form of a letter from Monroe's office that Clara had not been expecting. She read it at the kitchen table while Abigail poured tea and Edmund ate breakfast, and she read it twice before she said anything, because the first time through, she was not sure she had understood it correctly. "Monroe has received a second filing," she said. Edmund looked up. "From the Ashford estate?" "No." Clara set the letter down. "From a woman named Mrs. Catherine Holt. She's the widow of a shipping merchant who died in 1811. She was referred to Monroe's office by one of the women I helped last month." She paused. "She has documentation showing that Silas Ashford did the same thing to her husband's accounts that he did to father's, beginning in 1803, 2 years earlier." The kitchen went completely silent. Abigail set down the teapot. Edmund stared at her. "He did it to others. At least one other," Clara said. "Possibly more." She looked at the letter in her hand. "Monroe is requesting that I come in this week. He says if there are multiple victims of the same scheme, the civil filing against the Ashford estate changes significantly. He says the total sum may be considerably larger than what we calculated. He says—" She stopped. She looked at the letter again to make sure she was reading it right. He says that with 2 confirmed victims and matching documentation, he can petition to reopen the estate accounting entirely. That it is no longer only a correction of record. That it is, in his words, a pattern of deliberate fraud. Edmund was very still. "Catherine Holt," he said slowly. "I knew her husband, Robert Holt. He—" He stopped. He rubbed one hand over his face. He also blamed himself. He died believing he had failed his family. His voice had gone rough again. "How many were there, Clara?" "I don't know," she said. "Not yet." She folded the letter carefully and stood up. "I need to go see Monroe," she said. "And then I need to write to Nathaniel." Edmund looked at her. "Why Nathaniel?" "Because if there are other victims of his father's fraud, he needs to know before Monroe files. He should not hear it first from a court document." She said it without hesitation, without softness, without any of the complicated feeling that had been accumulating in her chest over the past 6 weeks. Just clean and practical and honest. He has been doing the right thing. He deserves not to be blindsided. Edmund studied her for a moment. Abigail across the kitchen made no comment. "All right," Edmund said. She went to Monroe first. He confirmed everything the letter had said, and added one detail he had not put in. Writing, a third woman had contacted his office the previous day. A Mrs. Anne Farley, whose father, a textile merchant, had experienced the same pattern of account losses between 1807 and 1810. She had found the irregularities only after reading the public record correction in the probate files, which had been accessible since the morning after the hearing. The public record had done its work. 3 victims. Possibly more. The pattern was clear, the documentation was overlapping, and Monroe had the expression of a man who had spent 40 years waiting for a case of this particular quality to walk through his door. "This is no longer a quiet correction," he said. "No," Clara agreed. "It isn't. The Ashford estate will likely need to be restructured. The full liability could be substantial." "I understand, Miss Whitmore." Monroe looked at her over his papers. "I want to say something plainly. What you did coming here 6 weeks ago, pursuing the public record, rather than a private settlement, made this possible. The other women found their way here because the record was public. Because you refused to let it be quiet." He paused. "Your mother tried to stop one man. You may have stopped the same harm from continuing in perpetuity." Clara looked at him for a moment. She thought about the letter. About darker ink and harder pressed words, and a woman running out of time. "She started it," Clara said. "I only finished it." She wrote to Nathaniel before she went home. She sat in Monroe's outer office and used the clerk's writing table and wrote him everything. The Holt filing, the Farley contact. Monroe's assessment of the expanded liability. The probability that the estate restructuring would be significant. She wrote it in plain language without softening any of it. At the bottom she wrote, "I am telling you because you have been doing the right thing and you deserve to know what is coming before it arrives. This is not a warning, and it is not a negotiation. It is what I would want if our positions were reversed." She delivered it by messenger and went home. His reply came before evening. It was the shortest thing he had ever written to her, only 4 lines. I received your letter. I have spoken with the estate attorneys and instructed them to cooperate fully with Monroe's expanded filing. Whatever the liability is, the estate will meet it. This was my father's debt. I am not going to spend the rest of my life running from it. Clara read it standing in the hallway with her coat still on. 4 lines. No qualification. No negotiation. No careful language designed to protect his position. She folded it. She held it for a moment. Then Abigail appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at her face and said, "Good news or complicated news?" "Both," Clara said. "Always both." She came into the kitchen and sat down and told her aunt everything, and Abigail listened without interruption. And when Clara finished, they sat together in the quiet of the kitchen, with the late summer light coming in long and gold, and the sound of the street outside going about its ordinary business. And Clara felt something shift in the architecture of her chest. Some weight redistributing itself, some tension loosening that she had not fully known was there. She was not healed. She knew that. The grief was not finished. The work was not finished. The complicated, unresolved thing she felt every time she read one of Nathaniel's letters, that careful accumulation of evidence that a man could change, laid against the clear-eyed knowledge of what he had allowed, was not finished either. None of it was finished. But the truth was in the record. The lie was corrected. Other women were finding their way to Monroe's office because the record was public. Her father was sleeping. The fund existed. 3 victims had been found, and there would be restitution, real and full and documented. And Nathaniel Ashford, who had stood at an altar in silence and let her walk away, and then spent 6 weeks methodically correcting every wrong. He had the power to correct, had written 4 lines that contained more honesty than most people managed in a lifetime. She thought about what she had said to him at the fence gate, what felt like a different version of her life ago. "I will not marry the man you were. I may choose the man you become." She had not taken that back. She had not forgotten it either. "What are you thinking?" Abigail asked. Clara looked at her. This woman who had read a letter by candlelight and said he knew in the same quiet voice she used for everything true and important, who had made large pots of tea and pinned newspaper clippings to the wall and sat beside her at a judge's table and pressed her hand without a word. "I'm thinking," Clara said slowly, "that I need to meet with the attorneys next week about the fund structure, and that the Holt and Farley women should be introduced to each other, and that Father needs help going through his business contacts to rebuild what was damaged." She paused. "And that I am not ready to forgive Nathaniel yet, but I am not the same woman I was 6 weeks ago, and neither is he, and I think something is going to happen in the space between those 2 facts that I do not yet have a name for." Abigail was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That sounds about right." "Yes," Clara said. She got up and put the kettle on because the work was not finished, and the tea had gone cold, and tomorrow was already coming with everything. It was going to bring the attorneys and the filings, and the women who would arrive at the kitchen table with their folders and their carefully controlled expressions of someone who has found something wrong, and finally found someone who will take them seriously. Tomorrow was coming, and Clara Whitmore was ready for it. The attorneys met with Clara on Monday morning, and by noon they had the fund structure drafted in clean legal language that would hold up to scrutiny from anyone who tried to challenge it. She had insisted on 3 things from the beginning. First, the Eleanor Whitmore Fund would be independently administered, not attached to the Whitmore family business, not dependent on any single donor, structured so that it could survive the deaths or financial reversals of everyone currently involved in running it. Second, the services would be free to any woman who needed them, without means testing, without reference letters, without the requirement that she come with a man's endorsement or a lawyer's introduction. Third, the fund's records would be public. Every case handled, every outcome achieved, every sum recovered documented and accessible. No quiet corrections. No private settlements that disappeared into silence. The attorneys had looked at that third requirement with the particular expression of men encountering a principle they found inconvenient. "That level of transparency is unusual," the senior attorney said carefully. "Yes," Clara said. "That is rather the point." They drafted it her way. Edmund had come with her to the meeting, and on the walk back he was quiet for several blocks, the kind of quiet she had learned to read over the past weeks. the quiet of a man still adjusting to a version of himself that did not carry 11 years of false guilt. Then he said, "Your mother would have argued with the attorneys too." "I know," Clara said. She argued with everyone who tried to make inconvenience into a reason. Edmund looked at her sideways. "Where do you think you learned that?" She almost smiled. Almost. The civil filing resolution came through in the third week of September, and it came larger than anyone except Monroe had anticipated. The expanded accounting, incorporating the Holt accounts, the Farley accounts, and 2 additional victims who had come forward after the public record, drew attention to the pattern had revealed that Silas Ashford's manipulation had been running since 1801. 14 years. 5 families. The total liability calculated with interest by Monroe's office, using the most conservative possible figures, was substantial enough that when Monroe read it aloud in his office, Clara heard Edmund make a sound she had never heard from him before, a short, hard exhale, like a man who has been holding his breath for a very long time and has finally been given permission to stop. The Ashford estate restructuring would take months to finalize. Some properties would need to be liquidated. The Massachusetts Mercantile Bank had opened its own internal investigation following the expanded filing, and 2 of the officers who had facilitated Silas Ashford's transfers had already resigned. The bank board was under pressure from several quarters, and moving with the particular anxious speed of an institution that has realized the story it is part of is not going to get quieter on its own. Nathaniel had not contested a single item. His attorneys had filed a cooperative statement on the first day of the expanded accounting and had not deviated from it. When Monroe's office requested additional documents from the estate, they arrived within 48 hours. When the bank's internal investigators asked to interview Nathaniel directly, he had agreed without condition. Clara heard all of this from Monroe, not from Nathaniel himself, because Nathaniel had stopped writing letters. He had sent the last one, 11 days after the expanded filing began, short factual reporting, the cooperative statement, and the document delivery. At the bottom, in that same slightly different handwriting he used when he was writing something he had not planned to write, he had said, "I think I have said everything I can say in letters. The rest is not something that translates well to paper. I will not write again unless you ask me to." Clara had read that line 4 times. She had not written back. She had gone back to work. The attorneys, the fund, the women at the kitchen table, the long, careful process of building something that would outlast the immediate emergency. She had not stopped thinking about that line. She had simply set it aside, the way you set aside a question you are not ready to answer, not because you are afraid of the answer, but because the answer requires more of you than you currently have available. She had been doing that for 11 days when the charity dinner invitation arrived. It came from the Boston Women's Benevolent Society, the oldest and most socially significant charitable organization in the city, the kind that had existed long enough to have outlasted 3 generations of its founders and accumulated enough institutional authority that an invitation from it was not precisely optional for anyone who cared about their standing in Boston society. Clara had never been asked to attend before. The invitation was formal, engraved, addressed to Miss Clara Whitmore, and requested the pleasure of her presence at the Society's autumn benefit dinner at the end of October. At the bottom, handwritten by someone who was clearly not the engraver, "We would be honored if you would say a few words about the Eleanor Whitmore Fund. The Society has discussed making a substantial contribution. M. Cavendish, President." Abigail read the invitation over Clara's shoulder and said, "Margaret Cavendish. You know her. I knew her mother. Margaret has been president of the Society for 9 years and has the particular quality of a woman who does not make an invitation like this without being completely certain of what she wants and equally certain she is going to get it." Abigail paused. "She wants the fund. The Society's endorsement would give you access to half of Boston's philanthropic money." "I know what it would give me," Clara said. "Then what are you thinking about?" Clara set the invitation on the table. "He'll be there," she said. "Those events the Ashford family has attended that dinner for 30 years. It would look like cowardice for him not to go given everything. And you haven't spoken to him in 6 weeks. 11 days since the last letter." Clara said with the precision of a woman who had been keeping track without intending to. She noticed Abigail's expression and said, "That is not what it looks like." "I didn't say anything," Abigail said. "You were about to." "I was going to say," Abigail said mildly, "that you should write back to him. That is all. That the silence has gone on long enough, and you are not a woman who runs from hard conversations, and you have been acting like one for 11 days. Clara looked at her aunt for a long moment. She picked up the invitation and said, "I'm going to the dinner." She wrote to him that evening, not about the dinner. She wrote about the fund. First, the structure, the transparency requirement, the attorney's discomfort with the public records provision, and her insistence on keeping it. She wrote about the 5 families, and what the expanded accounting had found, and what it meant for each of them. She wrote about a woman named Margaret Holt, Catherine Holt's daughter, 20 years old, who had come to the kitchen table 3 weeks ago, not with documents, but with a question. Is there a way to learn how to read these things myself, so that I am never in my mother's position? Clara had spent an entire afternoon teaching her. At the bottom of the letter she wrote, "You said the rest does not translate to paper. You may be right. The society dinner is the last Saturday of October. I will be there. If you intend to be there as well, I would like to know in advance. Not to arrange anything, just to know." She sealed it and sent it before she could reconsider. His reply came the next morning. "I will be there. I have no intention of hiding from the room or from you. I will not approach you unless you indicate that you want me to. But I will be there." She read it once. She folded it. She put it in the desk drawer with the others. She went to work. October moved the way. Autumn moves in Boston, fast and cold and beautiful, stripping everything back to essentials. The fund took up most of her days and a fair portion of her nights. The women kept coming. Some had documents. Some had only suspicions and a folder of papers they could not parse. Some had already lost everything and came simply because they needed someone to confirm that what had happened to them was not their own failure, that it had a name, a pattern, a mechanism, and that the mechanism was not their fault. Clara confirmed it for every one of them. She was not gentle about it exactly. She was thorough. She was precise. She was the kind of help that respects the person being helped enough to give them information rather than comfort, because information was what they needed to act, and comfort without information was just a soft place to grieve. But she also, with several of the women, said things that had nothing to do with documents. She said, "Your mother was protecting you. That is not the same as failing you." She said, 11 years is not too long to correct a thing. The truth has no expiration date. She said to a woman who had been apologizing for crying since the moment she sat down, "You are not hysterical. You found something wrong and you came to the right place. That is exactly what you were supposed to do." She heard her mother's voice in some of those sentences. She did not find that painful anymore. She found it accurate. The night before the dinner, Helena Ashford came to see her. Clara had not expected that. She had prepared for many things about the following evening, but she had not prepared for Nathaniel's mother appearing at Abigail's door on a Friday evening with no walking stick this time, and no performance of social superiority. Just a woman in a dark coat, who looked older than she had 2 months ago, and held herself differently, less like a fortress, more like a building that had recently undergone significant structural revision. Abigail let her in without comment and went to make tea. Helena sat across from Clara at the kitchen table, the same table where Clara had refused her settlement offer, where 7 women a week now sat with their folders and their careful faces, and for a moment she said nothing. Then she said, "I knew." Clara went very still. "Not all of it," Helena said. "Not the full extent. But I knew Silas had managed the Whitmore accounts in a way that benefited us. I told myself it was business. I told myself men like my husband understood things about money that I did not need to understand." She paused. Her voice was controlled, but not cold, the control of a woman managing something that would otherwise be unmanageable. "I told myself a great many things, for a great many years." "You told yourself what was convenient," Clara said. Her voice was even. "Yes," Helena said. "I did." The kitchen was very quiet. "Why are you telling me this now?" Clara asked. Because my son is going to walk into that room tomorrow night and stand in front of the same people who have been watching this unfold for 3 months, and I know what he is going to do. Helena looked at her steadily. He is going to tell the truth about himself. Not just his father himself. His silence, his choices, what he allowed. She paused. And I wanted you to hear from me before that happens, that the silence in this family did not start with him. It started with me. With my father before me. With a tradition of convenience that I dressed up as practicality and handed to my son as if it were wisdom. Clara looked at Helena Ashford, this woman who had come to her twice now, the first time with a weapon, and the second time with something that was not a weapon at all, and she felt the complicated, unwilling respect of one honest person, recognizing another in the act of being honest for possibly the first time. "Does Nathaniel know you're here?" she asked. "No," Helena said. "He would have tried to stop me." "Why?" "Because he would have said it was not my confession to make in front of you, that I was making it about myself." A pause. "He would have been partly right." "And partly wrong," Clara said. Helena looked at her. "Yes." Abigail set the tea on the table between them. She sat down without being invited and poured 3 cups, and no one said anything about it. After a moment, Clara said, "What you told me tonight, I need you to be willing to say it in Monroe's office, on the record." Helena's hands stilled on the cup. "Not to create additional liability," Clara said. "The financial accounting is already complete, but the record should reflect that the silence was systemic, that it was taught, that is relevant to preventing the next version of this from happening." She looked at Helena without flinching. "You said the silence started with you. Put that in the record. Give other women something to point to." The silence stretched long. "Yes," Helena finally said. "All right." "Next week," Clara said. "I'll arrange it with Monroe." Helena nodded. She drank her tea. She stayed for another 20 minutes, and they talked, not warmly, not yet, possibly, not ever, in the way people who genuinely like each other talk, but honestly, which was rarer and more useful than warmth. When she left, Abigail looked at Clara. "You knew she would come," Abigail said. "No," Clara said. "But I knew it was possible. She is not a stupid woman. She has been watching what Nathaniel has been doing for 3 months, and she has been deciding whether she is capable of doing the same." She paused. "Apparently she is." The dinner was everything Clara had expected, and everything she had not. She arrived with Abigail and Edmund. And the room shifted the moment she walked in, that same key change quality she had felt at the dinner 2 months ago, except different in register now. Not the brittle attention of a room watching a scandal. The particular charged attention of a room watching someone it has already decided to respect, checking to see whether the reality matches the decision. Margaret Cavendish found her within 60 seconds of her entering the room. She was a small woman in her mid-60s, with quick dark eyes, and the handshake of someone who had learned early that a woman's handshake needed to be indisputable. "Miss Whitmore," she said. "I have been wanting to meet you since the morning that correction appeared in the probate record." "Mrs. Cavendish," Clara said. "Thank you for the invitation. The fund is exactly what this city has needed for 30 years, Cavendish said without preamble. "The Society is prepared to offer an endowment of $4,000 to establish the permanent operation. We will require a formal presentation of the fund's structure and an accounting framework for how contributions are managed." She paused. "The transparency requirement you insisted on with the attorneys, I heard about that. Keep it. It is the right instinct, and I will tell anyone who complains about it to their faces that they are complaining about honesty, and I will enjoy doing so." Clara looked at her. $4,000. "To start," Cavendish said. "There will be more if the results justify it. And based on what I have heard about your kitchen table, the results will justify it." Clara thought about 11 women. About Margaret Holt learning to read a ledger. About the afternoon she had spent teaching her, thinking of her own mother at the writing desk by the parlor window. She thought about a fund that would outlast all of them, that would keep working in 100 kitchens after every person in this room was gone. "We accept," Clara said. Cavendish nodded once satisfied. "Good. You'll speak after dinner." And she moved on to the next thing, which Clara recognized as the behavior of a woman who has been getting results for 6 decades by treating agreements as immediately operational. She saw Nathaniel 30 minutes later. He was across the room in conversation with 2 men she recognized from the bank board, a conversation that from the body language was not entirely comfortable for any of the 3 of them, but that Nathaniel was conducting with the same steady, unflinching composure he had carried into Monroe's office. He was not performing ease. He was simply there, present and accountable in a room that had been watching his family's name get corrected in the public record for 3 months, and he was not hiding from any of it. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. He did not move toward her. He had said he wouldn't, and he was a man who she had learned did what he said he would do. She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the gray eyes that gave almost nothing away, except that she knew now what almost meant. She looked at the man who had stood at an altar in silence, and then spent 3 months correcting the silence, 1 document and 1 letter and 1 conversation at a time, without asking her to forgive him faster than she was able to. She crossed the room. He watched her come, and he did not fill the approaching space with words which she had come to understand was one of the things about him that was genuinely good, his ability to let a moment be what it was, without talking it into something else. She stopped in front of him. "Your mother came to see me last night," she said. Something moved through his face, surprise quickly followed by a complicated expression that was not quite exasperation and not quite gratitude. "She did not tell me. She said you would have tried to stop her." "She was right." He paused. "What did she say?" "That she knew. Not all of it, but enough. That the silence started before you." Clara watched his face carefully. "She is going to make a statement for Monroe's record next week." He was very still. "She agreed to that." "Yes." He let out a slow breath. Not relief, something more complicated. The breath of a man who has been carrying 2 weights and has just discovered that one of them was going to be set down by someone else without him having to ask. "I don't know what to say," he said. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I told you months ago that I would judge you by what you did. I have been doing that. Every letter, every document, every correction." She paused. "You asked me once at the fence gate whether I was going to oppose everything. I didn't ask you that. You were thinking it." The corner of his mouth moved, almost. "Perhaps. I am not going to oppose everything," Clara said. "I am not going to tell you that what you allowed was acceptable, because it wasn't. I am not going to tell you that 3 months of doing the right thing erases 8 months of doing nothing, because it doesn't. Those are facts, and they are permanent, and they belong in the record, the same way everything else does." She looked at him steadily. "But I am also not going to spend the rest of my life using the worst version of you as the only version I'm willing to see. That is not justice. That is just another kind of silence." Nathaniel looked at her. His face had come entirely open, not the unguarded moment she had caught across Monroe's table, but something more deliberate than that. A man choosing to be seen. "What are you saying?" he said quietly. "I am saying," Clara said, "that I do not know yet what I am willing to build with you. I am saying that I need more time and more evidence, and more of exactly what you have been doing for the past 3 months. I am saying that I will not promise you anything tonight except honesty." She paused. "But I crossed the room. That means something." He was quiet for a moment. "It means something," he agreed. "Don't make more of it than it is," she said. "I won't," he said. "But I won't make less of it either." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she said, "I'm speaking after dinner. You should hear what I have to say." "I intend to," he said. She turned and walked back to find Abigail, and she felt his eyes on her back. The way you feel the presence of something that has finally been given the right amount of space to become what it actually is. The twist came during dinner between the soup course and the main, from a direction Clara had not anticipated. A man named Mr. Aldrich, a banking colleague of the Ashford family, who had attended the hearing as a silent observer, and had not spoken to Clara since came to her table and sat down uninvited with the expression of a man who has been deciding whether to do something for a long time and has finally made up his mind. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I have a letter." Clara looked at him. "From whom?" "From my father," he said. who died in 1813. He was a junior officer at the Mercantile Bank from 1799 to 1807. He placed an envelope on the table in front of her. He wrote this in 1811 and gave it to me with instructions to open it if the Ashford accounts were ever subject to scrutiny. He paused. He said he had been asked to facilitate several transfers that he did not believe were legitimate, and that he had complied because Silas Ashford was not a man anyone said no to without consequences. He said he had always regretted it. Aldrich looked at the envelope. I believe it names 2 additional account holders who were affected. Families we do not yet have in the filing. Clara picked up the envelope. She felt the weight of it. Paper and ink and a dead man's conscience arriving 11 years late to a reckoning that had been a long time coming. I will take this to Monroe tomorrow morning, she said. Aldrich nodded. He stood. He hesitated. My father was not a brave man, he said quietly. But he was honest enough to write it down. I hope that counts for something. It counts, Clara said. Bring yourself to Monroe as well. His testimony will strengthen the record. He nodded and left, and Clara sat with the envelope in her hand and felt the particular quality of a truth that keeps expanding, that refuses to be contained to the size you originally assigned it, that keeps finding new room to be whole. Abigail, who had watched the entire exchange, leaned over and said, How many families? 7 possibly, Clara said. Maybe more. Eleanor Whitmore Fund, Abigail said quietly. Yes, Clara said. Every one of them. She stood up after dinner at Margaret Cavendish's introduction, and the room went quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when they understand they are about to hear something they will remember. She had not written a speech. She had decided that 3 weeks ago that whatever she was going to say to this room, it needed to come from the same place. The decision to walk away from the altar had come from not performance, not calculation. Just the true thing, said clearly in plain language. She looked at the room. 300 faces or thereabouts, some of the same 300 who had been in the church in June. She thought about that. She thought about how a room can be the same room and mean entirely different things in different seasons. My mother was a meticulous woman, she said. She kept the household accounts herself. She could read a financial document the way other women read correspondence easily with full comprehension, aware of every implication. She passed that skill to me because she believed it was essential. She paused. She was right. That skill saved my family. It may save yours. The room was absolutely still. The Eleanor Whitmore Fund exists because my mother found something wrong in a document and had nowhere to bring it. She did not have a judge who would hear her in time. She did not have a legal framework that took her seriously. She did not have another woman who had been through the same thing and could tell her what to do. Clara looked around the room at the women with their careful faces and their good gloves, at the men who had gone still over their coffee. We are building that. We have helped 11 women in 8 weeks. We have recovered documented fraud against 5 families with 2 more cases currently under review. We are not quiet about what we find, and we will not be. The public record is not a courtesy. It is the mechanism by which the next woman finds her way to us. She paused. My mother did not get to see this. She ran out of time before the truth was in the record. But she wrote it down anyway, the truth clearly and precisely in case anyone found it. Clara's voice was steady and very clear. I found it. And everything that has happened since is the answer to a letter a dying woman wrote alone in a cold room asking for the truth to survive her. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Margaret Cavendish began to clap, and the room followed, and Clara stood straight in the sound of it, and did not let herself look for Nathaniel's face in the crowd. She already knew he was there. She already knew what she would find if she looked. She would look later. There was time now. There was more time than there had been in June, more room than there had been in the church, with the veil on the stone floor, and the silence pressing in from every direction. The rest of the evening moved with the particular quality of things that have been a long time building and have finally arrived at the moment they were always heading toward. She found him near the door at the end of the night. He had his coat in his hand, and he was watching the room empty, with the expression of a man who has been thinking about something for 3 months and has arrived at the place where thinking ends and speaking begins. Your speech, he said when she reached him. Don't, she said. I'm not going to compliment it, he said. I'm going to tell you something it made me understand. He looked at her directly. You said your mother wrote the truth down in case anyone found it. You found it and answered it. He paused. I have been trying to understand since June what the right thing looked like, what I owed, what correction actually means in practice. He stopped. Tonight I understood that it is not finished, that what you're building, the fund, the record, the women at your kitchen table, is the permanent answer to what my family did. And I want to be part of building that, not as penance, not to buy something back. His voice was even and certain, and offered her nothing she had not earned. Because it is the right work, and because you are the right person to be doing it, and because I have watched you for 3 months do the hardest kind of honest that exists, the kind that costs something, and I am not the same man I was at that altar. That is not a request, that is simply true. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the fence gate, and the 4 lines, and the letters full of documented corrections, and the grave he had stood at to reckon with a debt he had not created but had chosen to own. She thought about what Abigail had said. He knew. She thought about how knowing and what you do with knowing are 2 entirely different measurements of a person. Walk me out, she said. He fell into step beside her. They walked out of the dining room, and through the foyer, and out the front door, into the October night, the cold air coming in sharp and clean after the warmth of the crowded room, and they stood together on the steps, and the city moved around them the way it always did, indifferent and constant, and entirely unaware of the specific weight of any given moment. I am not forgiving you tonight, Clara said. I want to be clear about that. I know, he said. And I am not promising anything about what comes next. I know that too. But I am going to need someone to help me coordinate the expanded filing for the 2 additional families Aldrich identified. Someone with access to the estate attorneys and the bank documentation and the patience to work through a process that is going to take months. She looked at him. That is practical. That is work. That is all it is right now. Yes, he said. I understand. Good. She looked out at the street. She thought about her mother, who had asked for one quiet correction and had died waiting for it. She thought about what it means to take a wrong that was buried in silence and drag it all the way into the light, not once but over and over for every woman who came to the kitchen table with a folder and a carefully controlled face. She thought about what her mother had written at the bottom of the letter in darker ink, with harder pressed words, as though she needed the page to hold the weight of it. Your father never failed us. She was right, Clara said aloud. Not to Nathaniel particularly, just to the night, to the city, to the version of herself that had been carrying those words since June. About what? Nathaniel asked quietly. About truth being enough, Clara said. She said truth was enough. She was right. The truth was enough to bring down an 11-year lie. The truth was enough to find 5 families and then 7. The truth was enough to fill a room and change what a room believes. She paused. Truth does not need to be loud. It only needs to be said. She turned and looked at him one final time in the October night, and what she saw in his face was what she had seen in Monroe's office. A man stripped of the composure he had been trained to wear, looking at her without any careful distance between them. I will see you at Monroe's office, she said. Monday morning. Monday morning, he said. She went down the steps to where Abigail and Edmund were waiting, and she did not look back, and that was not coldness, and it was not distance. It was the simple and absolute confidence of a woman who has learned at some cost, and over considerable time, that she does not need to check whether the right thing is still there behind her. It is there. It holds. That is what the right thing does. Clara Whitmore walked into the October night with her mother's pearls at her throat, and the truth in the permanent record, and the future already